Okay, today we're going to be talking about realism and then also impressionism. I've been looking through a book I've got here called The Impressionists by themselves. It's a great book that looks at letters that the artists wrote to one another. They were a very close knit group of artists. We're going to start off with realism. No realism. Um, we're looking at really the late 1800s up until early 1900s, late 1800s to the very beginning of the 1900s, if you will. Um, the later half of the 19th century was a period of tremendous transformation historically and philosophically. During the Second Industrial Revolution, Western civilization became increasingly urbanized and industrialized. There was a renewed emphasis on the science and empiricism, and Western thought moved away from spiritual that mankind could find answers to humanity's greatest questions and concerns. These factors led to an interest in modernity, or the state of being modern, which led to the rise of realism. In this module, we're going to make connections between the Industrial Revolution, reviewed interest in science, and shift towards realism and art. Understand how the cultural shift in realism is represented with the dominant subject matter of labor and science. That was kind of tiny, I guess. Realism was a reaction against the strict norms of neoclassicism and theatrical romanticism in favor of the unidealized scenes of everyday life painted as they are observed. So think about, particularly at the end of the neoclassical and romantic. We had lots of dramatic. We talked about said drama 1,000 times, um, and real now they're kind of the realists are looking at it more towards that emphasis on everyday life, away from the religious influences, and more towards what is it that goes on in people's lives. We're looking at Courbet, described his own own artwork says, "I've never seen angels, but if you show me one, I'll paint one." And so the realists were captivated with this idea that they were going to whatever they were going to paint, they're going to be right there in front of them. They were going to really look at. They're going to use real live models. They're going to depict the scenes in and around them in the way that they see them. Courbet's Stonebreakers is inspired by the complete expression of human misery. The work of ordinary human labor scandalized the art public. In 1850, by keeping the workers faceless and anonymous, Courbet doesn't allow the viewer to identify with them. The weight of the tools and stone is concentrated on and portrayed through texture. So we can look at how he's using the texture of the rocks. Even really the wood and the hammer, the metal and so forth that kind of emphasize that tool aspect. Courbet painted the commonplace on a monumental scale, and again, we're kind of harkening back to those big, huge pieces we saw all through the Renaissance. This painting is over 10 feet tall, 22 feet long, depicting the funeral of an anonymous commoner and his undramatized depiction of life and death. So compare this, contrast these, the kings and queens with all the very ornate dress they would have. And still the large, massive scenes, but instead of in these formal, rich gold lace places, he's got this sort of dreary background, bleak landscape. And gone are those romanticized, pinks and greens and blues that made just crazy flowery backgrounds. Those um, that neoclassical sky and so forth. The Parasol School derived its name from the French village in the Fontainebleau forest that the artists moved into in order to be closer to their subjects. Again, they wanted to be right there painting what they actually saw going on. They weren't inventing these things. They were looking at people painting realistically what they saw in front of them. Led by Theodore Rousseau, the Barbizon School is characterized by unidealized and detailed landscapes that and later impacted Impressionism. So we'll already begin to see and you'll see Monet's depictions of haystacks is going to come directly from what we see going on in this background here. The way that the light is being depicted is all going to be picked up off of these types of work. Francis Millet was associated with the school, but didn't clearly represent the style. And the Gleaners, representing these three women picking the last of the wheat scraps and harvesting an activity for the very poorest people. In the manner of realism, Millet represents a detailed depiction of everyday life, but he strays from that realistic style with the inclusion of this sentimentality. He's beginning to put just the feeling, the emotion that you would get from recollection, from recalling being in this type of situation or being in this setting. The figures are monumentally placed in the foreground, giving them an air of dignity. Baptiste Camille Pizarro was generally considered a realist because his landscapes are more natural. His lack of sentiment did group him with the movement. When we look at this work of art, serene, the precision, we can see almost every individual leaf and so forth. This kind of has this emphasis again on the light draping across, and that's kind of a harkening back to how we saw that chiaroscuro movement through the later part of the Renaissance and then through realism and naturalism. Naturalism and neoclassicism and romanticism. The forest Fontainebleau in the later half of the 19th century was used. Art was used to make a political statement. One of the foremost realists with a serious political agenda was Amoureux de Muir. This artist was imprisoned by the government authorities in 1832 for creating a caricature of King Louis. In Transonian Street, this is a sort of one of those paintings when we harken back to the storytelling or the historical aspect and capturing those historical events. This is the depiction of a guard who was shot. This guard was in this area protecting the areas from unrest, and a worker shoots and kills him. As a response, the government goes in and kills everybody in this area. And that dramatic, instead of showing all the chaos that ensued with all the killing everybody, he just shows that guard, kind of the aftermath, or the person laying in the street there afterwards. Manet is probably the most important realist, only because Manet is like one of the most important impressionists. So he's not really an impressionist, but he befriends all the impressionists, supports the impressionists, and does some impressionist works of his own. But he represents these realist ideals because his style, particularly in the beginning, greatly influenced the impressionist artist. But he's starting with that realistic sort of influences. In Olympia, he features the Victorian maroon, represented in the traditional theme of the female nude. The strong, uncompromising techniques, such as the harsh shifts in tonality, shocked the art public and profoundly impacted later impressionists. So think about what they're talking about there is, you don't see those soft transitions on her skin from the chiaroscuro lighting. No, it's a harsh shift in those tonal. In Olympia, the subject matter offended the public. It's formal and iconographic references to Titian's Venus of Urbino. The painting portrays the cold and prosaic reality of truly contemporary subject. Venus has become a prostitute, confident and challenging the viewer with her calculating look. So we're also going to start to begin to see this French almost graphic illustrative style that we're going to see carried on, that was almost like a separate movement from the Impressionists. Manet depicts a pastoral scene in Luncheon on the Grass, different from traditional versions such as Giorgione and Titian. Manet does not depict gods or nymphs in the foreground, instead identifiable and contemporaneous figures. The nude is Victorine Marin, it's his mistress. The man at the cane is his brother. The other man is a sculptor named Ferdinand Latrobe. The foreground figures are exceptionally unidealized and exceedingly nonchalant. And the whole nonchalant aspect of the painting it just goes on all the time, was very controversial at the time. The open nudity was used in this space with these gentlemen was just very, very controversial. We look at the lighting. The nude figure is not only Controversial because where she is, but it's also very brightly lit. She is this white silhouette almost that kind of sticks out behind this very dark background. We do see that bright use of color there in the front left with the little blues again, as it harkens back to that figure that we see sort of framed in the background with the bright light kind of washing in on that one as well. And again, we see that emphasis on light, that's going to be bouncing right into Impressionism, which we're going to talk about next. Eakins is American realist. Thomas Eakins painted identifiable contemporary subjects just as they appear. In Eakins, the gross clinic, the detailed scene is almost too real. The famed surgeon Samuel Gross, bloody scalpel in hand, practices an operating theater of a medical college, similar to Rembrandt's anatomy lesson and Dr. Toole. Eakins' composition is a group portrait. The spontaneity of the piece, characterized by characteristic of realistic works, is achieved through the recoiling woman on the left, the open passage in the distance, and the sharp contrast of light and shade. And so the gross clinic, it looks gross. Homer, I love Homer. Winslow Homer is an American painter whose style is characterized by its directness, realism, and objectivity in splendid color. Homer did not consider himself part of the realist movement, but his works reflect the style, and he was quoted as saying, and I love this, "When I have selected the thing carefully, I paint it exactly as it appears." But he didn't consider himself a realist. It's like, come on, man, how is that not realism? During their final scenes of the Civil War, the artist, Holmes originally was a lithographer and illustrator serving as a battlefront Civil War correspondent for Harper's Weekly. During the final siege of the Civil War, the artist covered the area around Petersburg, where he first made studies of serious, realistic, and sensitive watercolors and paintings around the life of rural blacks. The sharecropper Homer's treatment of American subject matter in the viewed from a low vantage point with two powerful women that dominate this composition. The artist has captured the deep meditation, the downturned face of one, and a somber reflection of the yearning gaze of the other. Sargent and Muybridge, The Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd, by John Singer Sargent, depicts the children of his friend and fellow artist and their Paris home. The informal and seemingly random placement of figures inspired by Les Meninas, if you'll remember that Velasquez painting that was really cool. The reflection of the king and queen in the background and the portrait. The artist had painted himself in the portrait, but had the little kids kind of laying around, working around, getting ready, and this is kind of a reflection of that. The work has an air of spontaneity, is characteristic of those realistic works. Again, trying to capture a moment that it's happening as it's happening. Artists capture the real personalities of the ages of the groups and of the girls at their various ages, from the trusting innocence of the youngest daughter to the self-conscious, moody older daughter who reclines herself against the large Japanese vase in the shadows. Muybridge, one of the more impactful events in the world of the 19th century was the invention of photography. The invention of photography impacted realism in 19th century art. There was this interesting bet. Edward Muybridge was a photographer who most famous undertaking settled a bet between the governor of California on whether or not all four legs of a horse ever leave the ground simultaneously during a full gallop. So he captured the horse in a sequence of photographs to demonstrate that, yes, indeed, when a horse gallops, all four legs at one point, all four will be off of the ground. Pretty interesting. Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the short-lived movement in the later half 19th century, was a pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. This group of English painters and poets united in 1848 in reaction to what they considered to be the rote state and stagnant state of British art. The Brotherhood looked away from the increasingly industrial age in which they lived to the beauty, serenity, and relative simplicity of Italian painting prior to Raphael, for whom they saw as the fountainhead of academicism. Despite fondness for simplicity, the movement style was highly meticulous in detail with realistic techniques. And so this also is one of those influences that looks at some of what we'll see later with the French, again, sort of graphic, illustrative, artistic styles that kind of break away from what the Impressionists were doing. The Raphaelites did not find their inspiration from contemporary scenes, but biblical classical literature or historical sources. This is Ophelia. This is harkening back to Hamlet. The artist spent 4 months painting the background and vegetation for his work. The flowers floating on the surface of the water are not just decorative and naturalistic, but selected for the traditional symbolic meaning. And then there's lots of symbolism. The poppies are death, daisies innocence, and so forth. Some of the flowers which Millais included are referred to in Act 4, Scene 5 of Shakespeare's tragedy, in which Ophelia recites the names of flowers she has been gathering. We're going to look at Impressionism, Post-Impressionism also. Let's move on. Post-Impressionism we're actually looking at next week. I love that quote. We're not going to do the discussion, but I want to go back here if I didn't. Yeah. They asked in the discussion that you all aren't going to do. I don't think we've got this set up. But they choose the Courbet quote, "Show me an angel, I'll paint one," as representing realism. I think they should have chosen Homer's quote, in which he doesn't even consider himself a realist, though, where he chooses his subject carefully and paints it exactly as he sees it. So the Impressionists, who are they, what do they do, and what's different? Began in 1874 when a group of artists came together to show their own works, bypassing the official and rigid salon exhibits in the French Academy. Impressionist captures a moment and concentrates on the impression of them present, not necessarily the reality of what's going on. The realist were concerned was representing the actual present. The Impressionists wanted to capture that visual impression, that how did the light look, and so very often they're kind of trying to capture more than just what we see. Impressionistic subjects did not come from the Bible, nor history, mythology, or any of the social contemporary. They were what you saw around. They were looking at landscapes, at the cafe, what went on in the cafes, and that they frequented, and we see lots of bar scenes, restaurant scenes, scenes of theater, dance, activity going on in and around what the artists were doing. The name got its movement from Sunrise Impression, or Impression Sunrise, I should say. This is a Monet painting from that original show. Critics referred to the work as impressionistic, meaning unfinished and unpolished, and an intent to belittle the art. Little did they know they were creating a whole movement. This was considered to be a harsh attack on the rigid formalism of the French academic style. Monet was pleased with the impressionistic and was a depiction of their artwork and claimed the term as their own. It says we'd embrace it. Yes, we're impressionists. Yes. It denotes the speed and spontaneity that they worked with. Again, they're really trying to quickly capture what's going on in this moment. And so it's an evolution from that realism. It goes beyond realism. It's capturing more light than the realists were capturing. The Impressionist Sunrise Monet sought to capture that instant fleeting glimpse of the portrait, the lahar of sunrise on canvas, the rich, vibrant colors. Broad brushstrokes move the viewer's eye and convey a fleeting moment being captured, an actual impression. In Monet's Woman with Parasol, this epitomizes the impressionist concept of the glance. Monet's painting is a snapshot in time, a stroll on a beautiful sunny day. Brushwork color, especially spontaneity, it creates spontaneity. The wind is mimicked on the folds of her dress, as well as the physical representation of the breeze. You can almost see that breeze depicted in the brush strokes there in the flowers. Monet selected an upward worm's view perspective by cropping his son, showing him only from the waist up. Monet imitates a snapshot that captures a moment in time, as if this just really happened right there in front of him. The colors throughout the composition unify the scene. The green underside of the parasol binds with the green of the hillside, lined with the handle, leads the eye up to the green of the parasol and back to the green of the hillside. So again, instead of trying to capture the exact colors of what we're realistically seeing, he's using the impression of what is happening as a reflection of how he sees what's going on in that very moment. And so this is where we kind of look at Manet again. Manet revisited here. Manet was introduced by Parasol to Cezanne, Pizarro, Degas, Monet, Renoir, Sisley. They had a group of their own, Bastille, Bastille, something, I forget the name of the group. But anyway, he was part of this group. And we see Manet kind of going from that realism into this impressionism. And so this is a scene called the bar at Fior Berger. The foreground is a bar with drinks and flowers. The fruit is cropped. Extends the viewer into the space, pulling the viewer into that bar behind where the barmaid is. Behind her, though, we see this reflection. If you notice, her reflection is off to the right, even though the mirror is directly behind her. She's square in front of us. We would see her reflection directly behind her, but he's chosen to shift that to the right as showing this is how I'm breaking from realism in a lot of ways and dissolve that traditional picture structure. Pizarro, the Impressionists, presented 8 shows between 74 and 86. The only artist to exhibit at each one of them was Camille Pizarro. Pizarro's style is characterized by his careful craftsman-like quality, and is more considered, more detailed than the other Impressionists, with softer brushstrokes. Pizarro depicted a moment in the middle-class people, buildings, carriages, trees, and kiosks in the streets of Paris. And again, they were focused on what was going on around them and capturing those moments. But even though we see the detailed aspects of it, it's that light that we see being captured. Asymmetrical composition, as if it was naturally cropped as we were to look out the window. Is informal and casual position of the figures below convey that movement. The viewer's eye is catching a glance of the scene going on. The scene, common subject impression, because Paris is just big, expensive monumental change. In response to rapidly growing population of the city, Napoleon III ordered a complete redesign of the city under Baron Georges Eugene Hasson in 1852. Hasson's plan transformed to a great extent that medieval Paris into a modern sort of city, if you will. Marceau and Renoir. Marceau, Marceau exhibited her work alongside Monet, Pizarro, and others she identified studied under Corot and Manet, who was her brother-in-law. Marceau concentrated on the domestic scenes with grace and delicacy. We look at the subjects, the everyday class, the techniques, the loose brushstrokes that are associated with this movement, this impressionism, the color, the pulsating, vivid colors. We see those brushstrokes overlaid each other that create a lot of sort of vibration with those colors. The figural arrangement, informal, kind of spontaneous. The figures don't look posed real well. They're just like capturing what they're doing really quickly. Framing of that cropped glance type of compositions lend to that spontaneity. Renoir was one of the most famous impressionists. I'm known for the sensuous and light within his paintings. La Moline de la Galette, shown in the Impression exhibit in 1877, depicts a scene with some of Renoir's friends, captures alive the joyful atmosphere of the dance garden on the Bout de Montmartre. I'm terrible with French. The moving crowd of the Parisians bathed in natural and artificial light is creative, vibrant, brightly colored brushstrokes. So it's important to recognize that they mention here the interior lighting as well as exterior lighting. Not only do we see a lot of the scenes outside where we're capturing, whether it's Monet and haystacks, whether it's Cézanne or Degas and flowers and so forth outside, we're also thinking about how they captured the artificial lighting, if you will. Degas, one of my very favorites, was known for these paintings of these dancers. He did not have an interest in landscapes. Instead, he was fascinated by that indoor lighting, that artificial lighting. Degas admired the linear perfection of the neoclassicists, and many of their compositions are reflected in his. Where line is concentrated, Monet and Renoir are different ends of the impressionistic spectrum. Degas is known for his many depictions of dancers, a favorite subject painted throughout his career. In this dance class, you're going to see that cropped, asymmetric, informal, random placement of the figures. A repetition is created in these dance figures that is part of that capture that moment. But it's also very indicative of Degas' use of repetition and creating rhythm in his works of art. We see them kind of getting small on the back as it creates that sense of space and depth. Degas was known for his use of pastels, breaking away from the traditional paints, oil paints. Oil paints take a long time to dry, and they layer off. And so to kind of create that spontaneity that we want, that the artists were looking for in the impression, they begin to use these dry sticks of color. Again, he allows them to develop his treatment of line. Nudes were his favorite subject. Later years, the impressionistic fashion of the nudes were introduced. The traditional poses are seen in the tub. This pastel was presented at the last Impressionist exhibition in 1886, one of a series of 7 paintings produced by Degas in the mid-1880s, a theme of women in their bath. His depiction of their intimate, everyday gestures contrasts with the traditional romantic scenes of ladies at their toilet. Marie Cassatt, one of the more famous female artists of the time, was the only American impressionist exhibited with the giants of the movement. Degas was especially fond of her work. Also American, I forget to mention that. I didn't forget, but I forget to emphasize that American. Fond of her work as a de facto mentor for the artist, and became a de facto mentor. Women and children were her most frequent subjects. She used that informal placement, the crop, bright colors, all again, and then sort of vigorous use of the brushstroke. In the bath, Cassatt provides a glimpse of the unidealized duties of motherhood. The solidity of the figures is juxtaposed by the flatness of the wallpaper and the rug, similar to Degas' The Tub. The effect is derived from Japanese prints, which profoundly impact on the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. We're going to see those Japanese woodcuts and their use of pattern and repetition kind of game and their handling of color impact those Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. You will only have that one assignment due this week. That is at the end of the Realist. Next week, we'll take a look at the Post-Impressionists. But we want to consider it right now at this moment how the Realists, how the Impressionists kind of are two ends of the same spectrum. Showing the same moment versus that actually what's going on versus the impression of what's going on, and how Manet sort of bridges the gap between those two movements. All right, guys, have a great day.